everybody, this is the Wikstrand. So, it is James Bond month and this list is going to be about the not so good James Bond films because there are a few out there who, aren't too good. Comprising a list of the 10 worst James Bond films was a little bit of a tricky task because technically none of them are really terrible movies. They're just a bit underwhelming and in some cases frustrating to watch for, one reason or the other. So bear in mind that none of these movies are technically a terrible movie. They're just underwhelming and not as good as the other ones. So here we go with the list. The rules for this one is that it has to be the official James Bond films. I'm not going to count either Casino Royale or Never Say Never. Otherwise, I would say that Never Say Never would probably have been my second least favorite James Bond film. It's not a very good movie, it doesn't really have the feeling of a James Bond film. But on with the list. Number 10, Die Another Day. When I watched Die Another Day the first time, 20 years ago, and I came out from the movie theaters, I said to myself, they have completely destroyed James Bond. They have completely shit the bed on this one. This just might be the worst thing I've seen in the entire franchise. I had not rewatched Die Another Day until about 3 weeks ago when I watched it for the purpose of rewatching all the James Bond films, and what I discovered watching it then was this movie is very stupid. This movie feels like an early 2000 action films, where all the people get to fight a separate, villain, and it has all the bad action movie cliches. But the fact is that for all the stupidity it has, the VR, the ice castle, the laser beams from outer space, the invisible car, and the stupid hang gliding sequence, which still looks fucking terrible. The movie is completely bonkers, and I am entertained by Halle Berry's terrible performance. I am very entertained by the silly action sequences. I am very entertained by the fencing sequences, which is one of the low-key greatest sequences in James Bond history. The movie is very rewatchable actually because how insane and silly it is. It's like a throwback to the old cartoonish Roger Moore James Bonds. It is actually a pretty okay movie. I will say though that it is a bit too silly for its own good and it goes a bit overboard with it. And the special effects, well, they look really bad, but apart from that, this movie actually is a bit better than I actually remembered it to be. It's still not one of the better James Bond films, but it is a pretty damn okay movie actually. Number 9, Dr. No. Is it iconic? You bet your ass. Is it a classic? Yes. But it is also a bit boring and very clunky. Being the first film in a franchise doesn't automatically make it a great one. Dr. No is a herky-jerky movie with some fantastic sequences and some iconic moments. Ken Adams' fantastic production and Ursula Andress' fantastic entrance and James Bond fantastic entrance. And the dinner with Dr. No and all that stuff, they are great. But apart from that, the story is kind of, it's a hit and miss. It's a great way to introduce a character, and Sean Connery would make a lot better movies than this one over the years. But the story isn't the focus here. It's basically, just introducing a fantastic character to the movie-going audience and show off stuff they wouldn't normally see, because you would normally not go to these exotic locations, you would normally not have these spectacular stunt sequences, but some of them has aged pretty poorly, especially the quote-unquote car chase, which is one of the most obvious green screen effects I've ever seen. But one great thing that this movie does, and also can be applied to other early James Bond films, is that it is really fascinating to see what certain locations looked like in the 1960s and 1970s. Jamaica in 1962, you want to see what it looked like? Here it is. It's fucking amazing. But as a movie it's pretty okay. Number 8, The World Is Not Enough. Pierce Brosnan's third movie as James Bond has a fantastic opening. The amazing boat chase through London. That is great. That is fantastic. Apart from that, the story about, you know, him protecting Electra King from, you know, whatever danger they have and the oil pipelines and stuff like that was it was a hit and miss of a story. And apart from the fantastic boat chase, there's really nothing here that, you know, sticks out. We have a fantastic explosion in Kazakhstan. That's great. We have Robbie Coltrane returning as Zukov. That's great. We have Denise Richards trying to play a, you know, atomic scientist. That is super great and super stupid. And we have an attempt to have some kind of a psychological element to James Bond. That was not so great. And the entirety of the, third of the movie is pretty boring and pretty uninteresting. And Goldie shows up for some reason and is boring. There are bits and pieces of this movie that is really great, but for the most part this is one of the James Bond films that kind of runs on fumes, and, you know, the last third of the entire movie is pretty uneventful and unspectacular and a bit boring. Even though it should have been great, it isn't. Number 7. Diamonds Are Forever. The producers were able to lure back Sean Connery into the James Bond franchise with the help of what I guess is a very large stack of pound sterling bills after the debacle with George Lazenby, and we'll get to that. But Sean Connery's return to the franchise did not revitalize the whole thing. It was a disconnected, disjointed, kind of uninteresting story about, you know, diamond thefts and, you know, Blofeld kind of returning, and Diamonds Are Forever is one of these easy forgotten James Bond films where you don't really care about anything. It doesn't have any iconic moments or, you know, fascinating characters or good Bond villains. What it does have is a kind of assassins who I think are supposed to be gay, and some people might consider to be homophobic, but I at least find them to be incredibly entertaining and much more fascinating than actually James Bond was in this movie. They were also so cartoonishly goofy evil, so they kind of steals the show from even James Bond in this movie. Is it a bad film per se? Not really, but it is a movie that kind of runs on its reputation alone. It's a movie with zero iconic moments, minus maybe the moon car chase, which was fine, and with a very disinterested Sean Connery, and so you're not really that invested in the whole thing. Number 6, The Man with the Golden Gun. I've actually already reviewed this one on the Seychelles, on the top of a, you know, very large hill, and I'm gonna, you know, repeat myself a little bit. This was a pretty boring, pretty disinteresting James Bond film who had Christopher Lee of all people as the James Bond villain. This should have been great, but it never really functioned, and the whole third act was pretty boring, and you didn't really care that much for, you know, the cat and mouse chase that we actually didn't get between Scaramanga and James Bond. It has some fantastic moments like the karate school, and the car jump springs into mind, and the return of J.W. Pepper is of course fun, even though he has become so cartoonish that he almost becomes a parody of himself. It's, in short, it's another shoulder shrug, but the thing is that it is also a movie that could have been fantastic, but they have to subject themselves to these haunted house mind games bullshit in the end, which I thought was, well, bad. Number 5, Quantum of Solace. Do you know how to not make a good movie? Start filming it without a complete script. That's what they actually did for Quantum of Solace. Daniel Craig's second James Bond film was a movie that was too short and that never gave you time to breathe, and also was edited to absolute death. One of my theories about this movie is that they had been watching the success of the Jason Bourne movies over the years and said, we can do that, but with James Bond. It did not work. Only Paul Greengrass can really make these very rapidly cut sequences work, and to get the intensity in there. The intensity they kind of have, but that is not what James Bond is about. It's about being able to breathe and being able to take in the story and the scope and everything. And this movie was pretty ugly shot. The movie was a hodgepodge of... It felt like different kinds of action sequences and action cliches that in the end meant nothing, and the attempt of trying to, you know, get some some new modern themes in, you know, with climate change and stuff like that. Didn't work either because we didn't have a good Bond villain, and the ending was so rushed that we felt like, Jesus Christ, can we slow down? Usually I can applaud a movie that has a good pacing, but this movie, it has a too rapid pace that we cannot follow the story, and if the story feels disconnected from us. Nothing really memorable happened in Quantum of Solace, and Olga Krylenkova had to stink up the joint with her anti-chemistry and complete bland personality. The only, you know, supporting character that really sticks out of this one is Felix's partner, the bumbling idiot bureaucrat CIA dude. I liked him. They could have done something fun with him, but he was very effectively pushed to the side and was sort of never heard of again, so good job, everybody. Quantum of Solace is a Big Mac James Bond. It will feed you, but you will also forget it the second you have eaten it, or in this case, seen it. What was this movie, really? Number 4, A View to a Kill. Christopher Walken plays a James Bond villain. This should have been a slam dunk success, and maybe if they would have had Timothy Dalton already on board as James Bond, it could have worked. But now they have a 57-year-old Roger Moore in this movie who wishes he was somewhere else. And he just looks so disinterested, and he feels too old for this movie. And the story about microchips and Soren's attempts at taking over Silicon Valley and stuff like that could have worked, but doesn't. We have a boring Bond girl, and the only thing that kind of saves this movie apart from Christopher Walken himself is, of course, Mayday, played by Grace Jones, and her incredible presence. She's fucking awesome in this movie. She's always awesome, but in this movie she's particularly awesome. There is a couple of fun sequences in Paris where, you know, James Bond drives around in half a car. I found that to be quite funny, but apart from that, this movie feels disjointed, especially because, you know, there are some downright nasty and cruel sequences that doesn't really fit the classical Roger Moore, you know, portion of the James Bond franchise. It is too long, and it is not that fun, actually. The sequences on the, you know, Golden Gate Bridge in the end is kind of spectacular because, you know, nobody's ever actually filmed up there for realsies. I don't think they've done that since that, but it is spectacular, but it's too little too late. One of the only redeeming qualities of this movie is kind of a goofy sequence with a Russian agent that is double-crossed by Bond in a fun and kind of silly manner. I like that sequence, but apart from that, it is a slow-moving, sluggish affair to get through. Number 3, No Time to Die. This might be recency bias, but when I walked out of No Time to Die, I had this feeling inside of me that I am never going to rewatch this movie ever again. I'm going to treat this movie like Jason Bourne or Highlander 2. It doesn't exist. So we had to wait a long time to see Daniel Craig's final James Bond film, and they had promised us that we were going to, you know, dislike some bits of it, but I didn't expect me to dislike certain bits of this movie as much as I did. But the biggest problem this movie actually has is how boring it is. It is how dull it is. It is how grey and depressing and dark it is. James Bond is escapism. This movie was just a dreadful, dreary, boring movie that went on for far too long. The movie had a glacial pace, the worst James Bond villain of all time, boring characters, and a almost trolling ending to itself, which made me go, oh, for fuck's sake. This is one of these movies that the more I think about it, the less I like it, and the more things I find about it that I don't like. If I would have waited, you know, around maybe 6 months or something like that, it probably could have been number 1, but as it stands right now, it's still a very well produced and it's still a very well acted movie. I just would have wanted this movie to not feature James Bond. It could have featured somebody else that could have been even played by Daniel Craig, but they didn't have to call him James Bond because this movie almost doesn't qualify as a James Bond film. The more I think about this movie, the angrier I get, and I'm gonna stop now because this movie frankly doesn't exist. You're dead to me now, movie. Dead to me. Ha! Number 2. Thunderball. A controversial decision. There are many out there who think that Thunderball is one of the best James Bond films starring Sean Connery. This is also the most successful James Bond film of all time. I have rewatched this movie over and over and over again, trying to nail down why that is. Largo, is he a iconic Bond villain? Yes. Does he feed, henchmen to his sharks? Yes. Is Sean Connery iconic and awesome in this movie? Yes. Does he have a jetpack? Yes. But this movie is so boring. It often happens when you have a movie about underwater action, because underwater action moves, well, like it is under fucking water. And I didn't really care about the whole, extortion plan. And despite James Bond being suave as fuck, this movie is also boring as fuck. The underwater fighting between the two sides was hokey bullshit, and the fight on the boat is sped up, which makes it look like a Benny Hill sketch. And when we're not doing that, James Bond is at a fucking spa for what feels like a fucking eternity. And this movie is just so fucking boring. And despite having a fantastic villain, and despite having these fantastic sets and all the things, nothing really seems to happen in them. Apart from the slow pace of this movie, and apart from the boring aspect of the whole thing, it's difficult to exactly pinpoint where this movie goes wrong. Maybe it is just from the start, because it is boring. And number one on Her Majesty's Secret Service. There has been an attempt to justify the Star Wars prequels by some people who grew up with them. You are fundamentally wrong. They are not very good movies. They're not terrible, not awful, but they're not very good. There has been similar attempts to redeem On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and I don't know why. The thing is that this movie's problem can easily be spelled George Lazenby. In a short, he's bad. He was a model with no prior acting experience, and you thought that this was going to work? Bloody hell. And it is not only that he's bad, but his attempt at a James Bond is so weird. He feels like a confused college professor rather than a cool secret agent. And it takes so long time for the story that I don't know what the story actually was to get going, that even a fantastic sequence like the ski chase, which is great even though it is a little bit overrated, I think, it can't save it. We also have the wacky idea that James Bond is supposed to fall in love and get married and stuff like that in a couple of sequences that could have easily been fitted into, your pick of a sappy romantic comedy. And it was like, Jesus, can we move on? This movie also clocks in at almost 2 hours and 20 minutes. That is too fucking much. Add to that a baffling ending that must have made the moviegoers at the time go, huh? What? Telly Savalas, he's a serviceable Blofeld. The cinematography is fucking amazing. George Lazenby is fucking rotten, and the story itself, taken as a whole, is a subpar James Bond story. By and large, this movie is not very good. So I'll see you next time for Well So and So reviewing, well, such and such. Thank you for watching. Thank you very much.